In the silence of your own home, everything should feel safe, peaceful, unlike the world outside. But as the quiet deepens, so too does a creeping sense of unease. What was once a retreat from the noise becomes something far darker. Suddenly, the smallest sounds, creaks, whispers, soft footsteps, take on terrifying significance. And in that quiet, you realize, you are not alone. Something or someone has been waiting in the shadows. And the longer you ignore it, the more insistent it becomes. You might think that being alone in your house is peaceful, a chance to relax without distractions. It's the perfect opportunity to watch your favorite shows, read a book, or enjoy some well-deserved silence. But what if, in the quietest of moments, the stillness begins to feel wrong? What if the silence is not the peaceful retreat you thought it was, but a sign of something darker, something watching, waiting? Being alone is often seen as a gift, a chance to escape the noise of the world and just be. But sometimes, in the silence, there's something else. A presence, a disturbance, a feeling that you are never truly alone. It all starts innocently enough, doesn't it? You're sitting in your living room, perhaps scrolling through your phone, enjoying the peace of a quiet evening. But then the air in the room begins to shift. A chill runs through the space, faint at first, but enough to make you shiver. You dismiss it, thinking it's just the breeze from an open window or the AC kicking in. The sound of the television fills the room, or maybe it's just the ticking of the clock, but there's something in the back of your mind, something nagging at you. Maybe it's a sound you can't quite place. Maybe the shadows seem a little longer, a little darker, than they should be. It's hard to pinpoint, but something feels wrong. You glance at the window. The streetlights outside cast a soft glow through the curtains, illuminating the room, but there's no one out there. Just the empty street. Yet, somehow, the emptiness feels unnervingly suffocating. As you sit there, the quiet continues, and the feeling intensifies. You hear a soft creak, a faint noise from somewhere in the house. At first, you brush it off, just the house settling, you think. Houses make noises all the time. But then there's another sound, this one a little clearer, a little closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It could be the house again, right? Houses are old. They creak, they groan, they make odd noises. But then the footsteps grow louder, and you freeze. The sound of footsteps. They're not coming from outside, not from the street, but from somewhere inside your house. You sit still, straining your ears, but the sound stops. You think you imagine it, dismissing it as your mind playing tricks on you. But then, just when you start to calm down, it happens again. A soft shuffle. The sound of something, or someone, moving through your home. This time, it's closer. You stand up slowly, heart racing, trying to convince yourself it's nothing. It's just your imagination. It's just the wind, or an old pipe. But the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. You feel the temperature drop again, and you know, this isn't your imagination. As you move through the house, checking the rooms one by one, the silence seems to grow louder, more oppressive. The creaking of the floorboards beneath your feet is the only sound that fills the air. Each room feels colder than the last, the shadows stretching longer and deeper into the corners. You check the windows, but you check the doors, secure. Nothing is out of place. Yet the unsettling feeling lingers, creeping through the house like a thick fog. You try to shake it off, but your heart won't stop pounding in your chest. You return to the living room, trying to distract yourself. But then you hear it again. A tap. Just a soft tap, almost like someone's tapping on the wall or the furniture. The noise is too precise to be a coincidence, too deliberate. Your mind races, but your body remains frozen, paralyzed with fear. What could it be? You look around, and it feels as though the walls are closing in on you, the air thick with an unseen presence. The faint sound of breathing, low and steady, fills the space, but it's not coming from you. You're alone in the room, but the air is so thick with tension, it feels as though someone else is standing there with you, watching you. Your pulse quickens. Your first instinct is to grab your phone, but your hands shake as you reach for it. You dial the number of a friend, but the phone rings and rings. There's no answer. Of course, it's late, everyone's asleep. You hang up, but the feeling doesn't go away. The silence is deafening, but there's something underneath it, something lurking just out of sight. A sense that you're being watched. The tapping starts again, only this time it's not coming from the walls, it's coming from the other side of the room, from the darkened hallway that leads to the rest of the house. You stand frozen, your breath caught in your throat. The tapping is rhythmic now, almost like someone's trying to get your attention, or worse, testing you. You force yourself to move, to walk toward the hallway, but each step feels like it takes all your strength. Your mind races with every possible explanation. Could it be an animal? A neighbor? A prank? But none of it makes sense. You've lived here long enough to know the sounds of your home, and this is not it. As you step into the hallway, the shadows seem to stretch before you. The light from the living room barely reaches the far end. Your feet feel heavy, like they're dragging through the air. The tapping continues, louder now, more urgent. You stand at the edge of the hallway, straining your ears to hear where the sound is coming from. You peer into the darkened kitchen, the bathroom, and then, finally, the stairs that lead up to the second floor. Your mind tells you to turn back, to call the police, to get out of the house. But your body doesn't move. It's as if something is holding you there, compelling you to go forward. The moment you take your first step toward the stairs, you hear it, a door creaking open, slowly. But no one is there. The hairs on your neck stand straight. Your breath comes in shallow gasps. There is something in this house, something that shouldn't be. The house is supposed to be your sanctuary, a safe place, but right now it feels like a prison. Every corner feels too dark, every shadow too deep. You want to scream, to run, but something holds you there, paralyzed. The sound of footsteps, closer now, echoes in your ears. They're coming down the stairs. This is no longer a house you recognize. The walls, the floors, the very air in this space feel like they're closing in on you. You know deep down that you are not alone. But the question now is, what is here with you, and why are they waiting? You take another step, your heart pounding so loudly you think it might explode. Every instinct screams at you to leave, but the fear, the overwhelming terror, keeps you rooted to the spot. It's too late to run now. Whatever is in this house, whatever has been watching you, it's already here. You're not alone. And you never were. In that moment, the realization hits you like a cold wave. The house, this place you thought was your refuge, is something else entirely. It's not just the walls that make it home. Something darker has taken root here, something that thrives in the shadows, waiting for you to make a mistake. Waiting for you to let your guard down. You've been alone, yes, but the house has always had company. Something far worse than isolation. And now, the waiting is over. The evening started like any other. The house, an old Victorian in a quiet part of town, creaked and groaned as it settled into the night. Emma, a young woman in her mid-20s, had recently moved in, excited by the promise of independence and the charm of the old home. Her excitement quickly turned to unease, though, as she settled in for her first night alone. The house was large, and though she'd seen it during the day, the darkness seemed to transform it into something unfamiliar, something far more menacing. She'd spent the evening unpacking and getting her things in order, but now she found herself sitting on the couch in the living room, her phone screen casting a faint glow. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and suffocates you. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind outside and the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. She had the lights dimmed, the lamps providing just enough illumination to create deep shadows in the corners of the room. It was cozy at first, but as the minutes passed, Emma couldn't shake the growing sense that she wasn't alone. She tried to ignore it, pushing it down, convincing herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the house making her paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It only intensified when the hairs on the back of her neck prickled with the unmistakable sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. She glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The windows were closed, the front door locked. She even double-checked the security system, just to be sure. But still, the feeling remained. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and her pulse quickened, like she was being stalked, hunted by an unseen force. Her eyes flicked toward the front window. The street was empty, as it had been for hours. The house across the street had no lights on, and the only movement came from the rustling leaves of the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual. Yet, something about the scene outside made her feel small, insignificant, like she was being watched from afar, her every movement noted and recorded by a pair of unseen eyes. Emma stood up and walked over to the window, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She parted the curtains, peering out into the darkness, searching for any signs of movement. The street was bathed in moonlight, the shadows of trees stretching long across the sidewalk. The streetlights flickered occasionally, casting an eerie glow. No one was there. She sighed in relief, shaking her head. It was just her nerves. She was still getting used to the house, still adjusting to the solitude. But then, as she turned away from the window, she heard something. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but distinct enough to catch her attention. She froze, her hand still resting on the curtain. The sound came again, a faint rustling, like something brushing against the wall. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be an animal outside, a cat or a raccoon? No, this was something different. The sound was coming from inside the house. She quickly scanned the room, her gaze darting across the shadows. Her mind raced through every possible explanation: the wind, a door creaking, the house settling. But none of them seemed to fit. The noise came again, louder this time, and closer. It was coming from the hallway. Emma's legs felt weak as she hesitated at the edge of the living room, the shadows of the hallway stretching out before her like a dark, yawning void. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the mounting fear, but it was impossible. Her gut told her something was wrong, something wasn't right. She strained her ears, listening. The rustling continued, but now there was something else. A faint tapping sound. Soft at first, like a finger gently tapping on a wooden surface. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She gripped her phone tightly, ready to call someone, anyone, but something stopped her. Something told her she needed to investigate. Steeling herself, Emma stepped cautiously into the hallway, the dim light from the living room barely illuminating the edges of the darkness. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in on her. Each step she took felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. The tapping sound grew louder with each passing second, now accompanied by a faint scraping, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out in front of her, the darkness swallowing up everything beyond the reach of the dim light. She approached the stairs leading up to the second floor, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The rustling and tapping intensified, filling the silence of the house, but there was no one in sight. She reached for the banister, her fingers trembling as she stepped onto the first stair. And then it stopped. The house fell silent once more. Too silent. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She stood frozen, the air around her thick with tension. She looked up toward the second floor, her eyes straining to see anything in the inky blackness beyond. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. She took another step, and the silence was broken once again, this time by a low, guttural sound, a scraping noise from somewhere behind her. Emma spun around, her pulse racing. The hallway stretched out before her, still empty, but the noise was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic. She had to get out. She had to leave. But her legs felt like lead, too heavy to move, as if they were anchored to the spot. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding her in place. The sound came again, scraping, then a faint whisper. Emma could barely breathe, her chest tightening with each passing second. And then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. There was no more rustling, no more tapping, no more whispering. The house was still. Too still. Emma's breathing slowed, but the fear didn't ease. The house felt wrong. The silence felt suffocating. She turned and ran toward the front door, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs finally responding to her terror. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, with a rush of relief, the door was open, and she stepped out into the night air. But as she stepped outside, the world seemed to shift. The street was empty, silent, just as it had been earlier. But this time, the darkness seemed even deeper, more oppressive. The streetlights flickered once more, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. And there, in the distance, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the shadows, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized, with a sickening certainty, that she was not alone. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, hidden in the darkness, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned, running back into the house, slamming the door behind her. But as the door clicked shut, she knew the truth. Whatever was in the house with her was not going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. And the worst part was that she was never truly alone. She never had been. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a chance for Jake to finally unwind after a grueling week of work. His apartment, a cozy space on the top floor of a building in a quiet part of the city, was his sanctuary. It was his first time having the place all to himself in months, and the idea of a weekend free of distractions, emails, and meetings was a welcome relief. He made himself a cup of coffee, turned on his favorite playlist, and sank into his couch, eager to relax. The apartment was small, but it had a charm: exposed brick walls, large windows that let in just the right amount of light, and a soft, plush carpet that he'd always loved sinking his feet into. But as the evening drew on, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, nothing too alarming, just an odd shift in the atmosphere. Jake couldn't quite put his finger on it. The apartment still felt like his, but the silence seemed heavier somehow. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic from outside, everything seemed muffled, like the air itself had thickened. He chalked it up to the unfamiliar quiet of being alone. But then the noises started. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old building settling, nor was it the occasional shift of the apartment's wooden floors. This was different. The first noise came just after he sat down on the couch, settling in for the evening. A faint scratching sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the corner of the room. Jake furrowed his brow, turning his head toward the sound, but saw nothing. He checked the windows to make sure they were all shut. Perhaps a bird had landed on the windowsill, or maybe it was just the wind. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that crawled under his skin. He tried to ignore it, but then the sound came again. A quick, sharp scrape, this time louder, more distinct. He stood up from the couch, his heart rate picking up slightly. The air felt colder now, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling as he walked toward the source of the noise. It was coming from behind the bookshelf, which was tucked away in the far corner of the living room. Jake had always kept the space tidy, so he was certain nothing had fallen out of place. He peered behind the bookshelf, half expecting to find a rat or some other animal that had managed to sneak into the apartment. But there was nothing there. Confused, Jake walked back to the center of the room, trying to calm his racing thoughts. It was just the silence playing tricks on him, he told himself. The building was old, and sometimes noises just happened. But as he turned to head back to the couch, a low sound followed him, a faint whispering, just out of his reach, like someone was speaking to him in a language he couldn't understand. The words were soft, almost like a distant murmur, but they seemed to pulse through the room, wrapping around him like tendrils of cold air. He stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold. His eyes darted around the room, but everything seemed perfectly still. No one was there. The door was locked. The windows were shut tight. It was just him in the apartment. Still, the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if someone was just behind him, breathing down his neck. Jake spun around, his breath quickening, but once again, there was nothing. He tried to shake it off, blaming his overactive imagination. He had been working late the past few days, and the stress was getting to him. Maybe he was just hearing things. But as he turned back toward the couch, he felt it, cold, prickling fingers of fear crawling up his spine. The air had grown colder, the room now shrouded in an uncomfortable chill. He rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, but the temperature continued to drop. The whispering stopped, But the silence that followed felt even worse. It was thick and oppressive, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. With a sudden urge to break the stillness, Jake grabbed his phone and called his best friend, Ryan. It was a Saturday night, and he figured a conversation might distract him from whatever was going on. The phone rang and he waited, tapping his fingers nervously against the couch armrest. It wasn't like him to be this jumpy. He was alone all the time, and usually he enjoyed the solitude. But something about tonight felt different. Finally, Ryan picked up. "Hey man, what's up?" Ryan's voice sounded far away, still a bit sleepy, but Jake could hear the smile in it. "I don't know, dude. Something's off tonight. I can't explain it. Keep hearing things, scratching sounds, whispers. It's just, I don't know, I feel like I'm not alone, you know?" Ryan laughed, probably thinking Jake was joking. "Man, you're just scaring yourself. It's just an old apartment, right? You're probably just hearing the building settle or something." Jake didn't respond right away. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but his gut told him something was wrong. Something wasn't right. He glanced around the apartment again, trying to reassure himself. The quiet was suffocating. "Yeah, you're probably right. Just being dumb." Ryan yawned. "Get some sleep, man. You'll feel better tomorrow." "Yeah, I'm going to try. Thanks, man." Jake hung up, his thoughts still racing. He looked around, his eyes lingering on every corner of the apartment, every shadow. He had no idea why he was suddenly so on edge. He had lived here for months without a single problem. But tonight, the apartment felt different, like it was closing in on him. He stood up again and walked into the kitchen to make something to eat, hoping the distraction would help. As he pulled a frozen pizza from the freezer, he felt the temperature drop even further. A chill ran down his back as he pulled the pizza out of the box. He glanced around the room, his nerves on edge. And then it happened again. The scratching sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the corner of the room. It was coming from inside the walls. A quick, sharp scrape, like claws against wood. It echoed through the apartment, filling the space with a sense of foreboding. Jake's stomach twisted in fear. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The sound had grown too distinct, too real. His hands trembled as he dropped the pizza back on the counter, suddenly too afraid to eat. He stared at the walls, his pulse quickening as the scratching continued. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was something trying to get out, something trapped inside. The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. What was that? What was causing that sound? He turned to the door, considering leaving, but something stopped him. Was he really going to run? Was he going to let fear control him? He couldn't just leave. He had to find out what was happening. He had to prove to himself that there was a logical explanation for all of this. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and slowly made his way toward the hallway. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but the deeper he ventured into the apartment, the more he felt the sensation that he was being followed. He stopped at the wall where the scratching had been the loudest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He pressed his ear against the wall, hoping to hear something that would explain it all, some rational explanation, something that could put his mind at ease. And then he heard it again. A scraping sound, right behind the wall. Louder. Closer. It was as if something was just on the other side, just out of reach, but pushing against the barrier. The wall felt alive, like it was pulsing with whatever was inside. Jake's heart raced as the flashlight trembled in his hand. He knew something was wrong. Something was hiding in the walls, and it was waiting for him to let his guard down. And then it hit him. The whispering. The strange, soft murmurs that he'd heard earlier. They hadn't been his imagination. They hadn't been the wind or the building settling. They were coming from inside the walls. And whatever was trapped there, whatever had been scratching, wasn't about to stay hidden for much longer. Jake turned and ran. The apartment was quiet again, but it was a heavy silence, thick with an oppressive air that seemed to smother every corner of the room. Sarah had just moved in a week ago, the excitement of having her own space still fresh in her mind. She had spent the day unpacking, organizing everything just the way she liked it, and as evening fell, she was finally able to sit back and relax. The furniture was in place, the walls had their fresh coat of paint, and the faint scent of wood polish lingered in the air. She smiled to herself, thinking how this little apartment was going to be her sanctuary, her retreat from the chaos of the outside world. It was small, but it was hers. Or so she thought. The first few hours of the evening passed in peaceful solitude. Sarah had made dinner and was now sitting on the couch with a book in her hands, the soft glow of a table lamp casting long shadows across the room. The streetlights outside flickered faintly, but the apartment itself felt cocooned in warmth and calm. Yet, the more Sarah settled into the stillness, the more something began to feel off. It wasn't a loud, obvious thing, but more of a subtle shift, like the air around her had thickened. She glanced up from her book, and for a brief moment, it felt like the shadows in the room were watching her, bending and stretching in a way that was almost unnatural. She shrugged off the sensation, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of the place. It was an old building after all. The floors creaked, and the walls groaned when the wind blew. Sarah had grown up in an old house, so these noises didn't bother her. But tonight, the sounds seemed different, more deliberate. It was a feeling she couldn't quite shake, like someone or something was there with her, lurking just beyond her line of sight. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger as the evening wore on. As she turned the page of her book, she heard something soft, almost inaudible. It came from somewhere behind her. She stiffened, the hairs on her neck standing on end. It wasn't the usual creak of the house settling, nor the distant hum of traffic from outside. This was something else entirely, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails tapping on wood. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, and glanced over her shoulder. The room was empty. The door was locked, the windows sealed tight. But the sound persisted, now louder, coming from the direction of the hallway. Her heart began to race, and she stood up, slowly, trying not to make any noise. She didn't want to believe what she was hearing, but there was no mistaking it. The scratching continued, steady and unrelenting. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Something was in the hallway, just out of sight. Sarah walked cautiously toward the source of the noise, her footsteps barely making a sound as she moved through the darkened apartment. She reached the doorway that led into the hallway, pausing just beyond the threshold. The scratching was now accompanied by a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming on a hard surface. Her pulse quickened, and she took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. She stepped into the hallway, her shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The apartment felt unnervingly still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She walked down the hallway, each step making the floorboards groan under her weight. The walls seemed to close in around her, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted unnaturally in the dim light. Sarah's hand tightened around the doorframe as she passed it, her eyes scanning the shadows. She reached the end of the hallway, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The source of the noise was still just out of view, but the closer she got, the more the atmosphere seemed to thicken. It was as if the air itself had become colder, heavier, and the silence felt suffocating. The scratching had stopped, but now there was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like an electrical buzz that filled the air. Sarah's chest tightened, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She couldn't explain it, but something deep inside her told her she should turn around, leave the hallway, and never look back. But something kept her rooted to the spot. She was alone, wasn't she? She had locked the door, checked the windows. She had nothing to fear. Yet, the feeling of being watched crept over her like a cold shroud. It was as though something in the apartment was observing her, following her every move. She took a few more steps, her heart pounding in her chest, and the hum grew louder, more distinct, as though the walls themselves were vibrating with an energy she couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, a sound that made Sarah jump back, her heart leaping into her throat. It came from the attic above her head. The sharp crack of wood, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being moved. Her stomach dropped, and she froze, her breath shallow as she strained to hear. The house, the apartment, had been so still just moments before. There was no reason for that sound to be there. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Sarah backed away from the hallway, her feet stumbling over the floor as she turned to head back toward the living room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood straight up, and every instinct screamed at her to leave, to get out of the apartment. But she couldn't. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think about what might be in the attic, waiting for her to make a mistake. But there was no mistaking what she'd heard. There was someone, in the apartment. And it wasn't just the noises. It was the way the air felt, the way the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She reached the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and she stood there for a moment, trying to collect herself. The scratching was gone now, the hum had stopped, but the feeling of unease lingered, settling into her bones like a thick fog. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the attic door, the small wooden trapdoor that led up into the dark, dusty space. It hadn't been opened in years, not since the previous tenant had left. But now, the thought of that space, empty and abandoned, filled her with dread. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone from the coffee table and dialed her best friend, Emily. The line rang, and Sarah's hands shook as she waited for her friend to pick up. The ringing seemed to echo in the silent apartment, growing louder with each passing second. Finally, Emily answered, her voice groggy. "Sarah? What's going on? It's late." I don't know what's happening. Something's wrong with this place," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I keep hearing things. Scratching, tapping. I don't know if it's the house settling, but I don't know. It feels like something's here with me." Emily was silent for a moment. "You're probably just imagining things, Sarah. It's an old building, remember? The pipes, the floors, they make noises. It's nothing." Sarah bit her lip, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to believe her friend, to convince herself that it was just the building settling, just the wind. But the fear was too real, too intense. I heard something move. It came from the attic. I swear, it was like something heavy fell." Emily sighed on the other end. "Okay. Calm down. Look, why don't you check the attic? Just go up there, see what's causing the noise. If there's nothing there, you'll feel better. Just check it out and let me know, okay?" Sarah didn't want to, but she nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. "I'll let you know." She hung up the phone, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know if it was a good idea to go up there, but she had to know. She had to see for herself if there was someone, or something, waiting for her in the attic. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, walking toward the hallway once more. She could feel the cold air brush against her skin as she neared the door to the attic. The wooden trapdoor loomed ahead, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the old windows, but inside the house, it was unnervingly still. Claire had always loved the quiet, the solitude of being alone in her home. She was a writer, and her best ideas came when she was alone, sitting at her desk, surrounded by the silence of her thoughts. It was the kind of peace she had longed for after moving away from the chaos of the city. The small, charming cottage she had rented on the outskirts of town was everything she had dreamed of, until tonight. It started innocently enough, with Claire settling down in her favorite armchair by the fire, a cup of tea in hand. The warmth of the fire flickered across the room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She had spent the evening working on her latest project, the soft sound of her typing the only thing breaking the silence. The room, with its high ceilings and rustic furniture, felt welcoming, safe even. But as the night grew darker, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, and the air, once warm, began to feel colder, heavier. Claire had noticed it, but at first she dismissed it. It was just the weather, or perhaps the old house settling. But the longer she sat there, the more the unease crept up on her. It began with small things, objects slightly out of place, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was wrong but being unable to pinpoint what it was. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. She would look away for a moment, and when her eyes returned, the shadows would have shifted, seemed to stretch just a little too far. A chill ran through her, though she was sitting close to the fire, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the windows, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. She tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the stress of her work getting to her, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Then came the first sound, a soft, scratching noise, barely audible, but enough to make Claire's head snap up. Her eyes immediately darted around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow, every nook and cranny. But the room was empty. The silence returned, thick and heavy, pressing against her. Claire shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind, the house settling. It was an old building after all. But then the sound came again, louder this time, more distinct. A scraping as if something was being dragged across the floor. She sat still, her heart racing, her fingers gripping the armrest of the chair as she tried to listen, to make sense of the noise. The sound seemed to come from the hallway, just beyond the threshold of the living room. Claire stood up, her legs suddenly weak, and crept toward the doorway. The house was quiet again, but that silence was different now, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. There was something in the hallway, something just beyond her view. Claire hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorframe. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch longer, as if they were reaching for her, pulling her in. With a deep breath, she stepped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. The air grew colder the farther she moved down the corridor, and the floorboards creaked under her weight, as though something was just beneath the surface, waiting for her to make the next move. Claire's breath quickened, the fear bubbling up in her chest, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't let herself be scared. Not yet. She had to find out what was causing the noises, what was making her feel so uneasy in her own home. The hallway seemed impossibly long now, the darkness pressing in around her like a suffocating blanket. She reached the end, where the stairs led up to the second floor, and the sound, faint but distinct, came again. A soft scraping, like the edge of something sharp scraping against the wall. It was coming from above, from the attic. Claire froze, her blood running cold. The attic? The one part of the house she had yet to explore. She had been told the attic was off-limits, that it was in poor condition, but she had no idea why it would be sealed off, no idea what could be up there. She had never even thought to ask. Now, the thought of going up there filled her with dread. But Claire couldn't ignore it. She had to know. Her curiosity, the need to uncover the truth, pushed her forward. Slowly, she turned and walked toward the small door that led to the attic stairs. Her hand was shaking as she reached for the doorknob. The room around her felt colder now, the temperature dropping rapidly, and she could hear the faintest whisper in the air, as though the house itself was trying to tell her something. She hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow, then twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. The smell of dust and old wood hit her immediately, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. Claire stepped inside, her flashlight shaking as she illuminated the staircase that led up into the attic. It was narrow, steep, and the stairs creaked under her weight. With each step, the sound grew louder, the scratching now a constant hum, as though something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. She moved slowly, carefully, her breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. The temperature continued to drop, and her breath came out in visible puffs. As she reached the top of the stairs, the smell of mildew and decay grew stronger. The attic was smaller than she had imagined, the ceiling low and sloped, the wooden beams exposed. The walls were lined with old crates and boxes, their contents long forgotten. The room was dim, lit only by the weak beam of her flashlight. She swept the light across the room, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The attic seemed abandoned, untouched for years. Yet, the scratching sound continued, louder now, and Claire's heart thudded in her chest. It was coming from somewhere within the walls, as though something was trapped inside. She moved further into the attic, the air thick with dust, her flashlight beam flickering with each step. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the sound of the scratching grew louder. The noise seemed to be coming from the far corner of the room, from behind an old stack of crates. Her hand reached out, brushing the crates aside, her heart racing with each movement. And there it was. A small, hidden door, no larger than a closet. It was old, covered in dust, and the wood was warped with age. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the door, the scratching now a constant, maddening sound, coming from just beyond it. She had to open it. She had to know what was inside. Her hand reached for the doorknob, but as her fingers touched it, a cold chill rushed over her. The scratching stopped, and an eerie silence filled the room. The air seemed to still, as if holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Claire's hand hesitated. What was behind that door? What could be causing that sound? The silence dragged on, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Finally, with a deep breath, Claire turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hinges squealed in protest, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. No light, no movement. Just the oppressive silence. But Claire could feel it. Feel the presence, something just beyond her reach, something that had been waiting for her to open that door. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, her flashlight flickering once more. As the light fell across the room, she saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner, its back turned to her. Its face was obscured in the shadows, but the unmistakable sound of breathing filled the room. Claire's blood ran cold as she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure shifted, slowly turning toward her. And then the whispering began. Soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a voice. It was something else, something wrong, something inhuman. And Claire knew, deep down, that she had opened the door to something far worse than she could ever have imagined. She wasn't alone in this house. Not anymore. The rain started to fall heavily, pounding against the windows of the old farmhouse. Outside, the wind howled, twisting the trees into strange shapes as if they were reaching out toward the house. For Maria, it was the perfect night to stay in, curled up with a cup of tea and a good book. The farm had been in her family for generations, and despite its age and the occasional creaks and groans of the house, it had always felt like a safe haven. She had moved back here a few months ago to take care of things after her parents had passed away. The place was large, with multiple rooms and hallways that always seemed to stretch on forever. Maria found comfort in the familiarity of it all, even though there were parts of the house she avoided, the attic, the cellar, and certain rooms that had a way of making her skin crawl. She tried not to think about it. After all, it was just an old house. Old houses made noises. There were strange drafts and the occasional chill, especially on stormy nights like this one. But tonight, as she settled into her favorite armchair by the fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't just the storm outside, it was the house itself. The creaks seemed louder tonight, and the wind, howling through the gaps in the walls, felt colder, more biting. She wrapped her blanket around her shoulders tighter, trying to ignore the shiver running down her spine. The house was quiet, too quiet. She glanced toward the kitchen, where the faint sound of the refrigerator humming had always been a constant background noise. Tonight, though, it was strangely absent. Maria told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but the silence was unnerving. Her gaze flicked to the hallway leading to the back of the house, toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. The hallway was darker than usual, as if the shadows had grown deeper with the falling night. She stood up and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly. The view outside was nearly obscured by the heavy rain, but in the distance, she could make out the outline of the barn, dark and looming against the night sky. It was at that moment she heard it, a faint thud, followed by a soft scraping noise. The sound came from somewhere deep within the house, from the direction of the basement. Maria froze, her breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought it might be the house settling, an old floorboard or a beam shifting under the weight of the wind. But this sound was different. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around down there. Her heart began to race, and she found herself standing there, staring into the dark hallway as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The noise continued, low and persistent, followed by a dragging sound that seemed to echo through the walls. Maria hesitated, torn between investigating and running out of the house altogether. The rational part of her mind told her it was just the storm, the house, the wind, anything but something supernatural. But the fear gnawed at her, the same fear she'd felt when she was a child, when her parents had warned her not to go near the basement alone. Maria took a slow, steadying breath and made her way toward the staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house creaked around her as if it were alive, groaning under its own weight. With each step, the sound from the basement grew louder, more defined. It was like something was dragging across the floor, a slow, purposeful movement that made Maria's blood run cold. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as the noise reached its peak. The basement door at the far end of the hallway stood ajar, just enough for her to see a sliver of darkness beyond. She had never been this close to the basement in years. It was always locked or off-limits when she was younger, and even now, as an adult, she rarely ventured into that part of the house. But something was drawing her in, something compelling her to investigate, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. Maria knew she shouldn't go down there. But her curiosity, the need to know what was making that noise, drove her forward. She took a tentative step toward the basement door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The air in the hallway was thick with tension, heavy with something she couldn't quite place. It was almost suffocating. She twisted the knob, and the door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing in the silence. The stairs leading down into the basement were narrow, steep, and covered in dust. The air that rushed up from below was damp and cold, smelling faintly of earth and decay. Maria swallowed hard and stepped down onto the first step, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness below seemed to stretch on forever, an endless void that swallowed the light from the hallway. She turned on the small flashlight she had grabbed from the kitchen, its weak beam barely cutting through the blackness. With each step, the air grew colder, more oppressive. The scraping sound continued, but now there was a low thudding mixed with it, like the sound of something heavy being dropped repeatedly. Maria's breath quickened as she descended further into the darkness, each step feeling like it brought her closer to something she couldn't see, something she wasn't meant to find. She reached the bottom of the stairs, the light from her flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls of the basement. The room was filled with old furniture, crates, and boxes, things that had been left behind, forgotten over the years. But the strange sound was still there, echoing in the dimly lit space. It was louder now, and Maria could hear the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, shuffling in the corner. She pointed the flashlight toward the source of the noise, her hands trembling as she moved the beam across the room. At first, she saw nothing, just the clutter of old furniture and forgotten belongings. But as the light flickered across the far corner of the basement, Maria's heart skipped a beat. There, crouched in the corner, was a figure hunched over, its back to her. At first, she thought it was just a pile of old clothes or a pile of junk, but then it moved. The figure slowly turned its head toward her, and Maria's breath caught in her throat. Its face was pale, gaunt, its features twisted and contorted in a grotesque manner. The eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to stare directly into her soul, unblinking, as though they were searching for something deep inside her. Maria felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, and she instinctively stepped back, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. But the figure didn't move. It just stared at her, its eyes never leaving her face. The air in the basement seemed to grow colder still, and Maria could feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of a loud crash. Maria spun around, her flashlight swinging wildly as she looked toward the source of the noise. A shelf in the corner had fallen over, sending crates and boxes scattering across the floor. Her pulse quickened as she realized that the figure in the corner was no longer there. It had moved, or worse, it had disappeared. Before she could react, a chill ran through her body, and the flashlight flickered out, plunging her into complete darkness. She was no longer alone in the basement. The air was thick with an unsettling presence, something malevolent, something that had been waiting for her to step into its domain. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for the flashlight, desperately trying to turn it back on. The basement was completely still, but Maria could feel the eyes of the figure upon her, watching, waiting for her to make the next move. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. What was that thing? What had she just seen? The figure, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. And yet, there was no denying what she had witnessed. The strange noises, the shadows, the presence that had been haunting the house for so long. Maria had no choice but to face whatever was in that basement, to confront the terror that had taken root in her home. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. There was no turning back now. The wind was howling outside, louder now, its fury shaking the trees and rattling the windows. A storm had rolled in suddenly, the kind of storm that seemed to come out of nowhere, dark and relentless, as if the sky itself was trying to swallow the world. Inside the house, Emma sat motionless in the living room, the faint glow of the fireplace the only light in the otherwise dimly lit room. She had just moved in a week ago, excited to start fresh in this quiet, secluded house in the countryside. It was perfect for her, away from the noise of the city, surrounded by nature. But tonight, that peace was shattered. The house had a strange energy tonight, something Emma couldn't quite put her finger on, a feeling that seemed to creep up on her and settle deep in her bones. The house, a large Victorian estate, had stood empty for years before Emma had decided to rent it. It was beautiful in its old-world charm, with ornate woodwork and high ceilings, its every detail speaking to a time long past. But now, as the storm raged outside, the house felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. The walls creaked and groaned, and the floorboards shifted beneath her feet, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the storm and exhaling its own sighs of weariness. She had tried to ignore it at first, brushing off the eerie sounds as the house settling, as the wind pushing its way through the cracks and gaps in the old structure. But now, as she sat there, the silence seemed too heavy, the shadows too long. At first, it was subtle, a low hum in the air, a shift in the temperature that she couldn't quite explain. She had told herself it was the storm, the wind, the natural hum of an old house. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the sensation grew. Her skin prickled with unease, her heartbeat quickening every time the wind howled, as if it carried some unspoken warning with it. The air was thick, saturated with a presence that made her skin crawl. Emma felt like she wasn't alone, like someone, or something, was watching her from just out of sight. The idea was absurd, she knew that, but it didn't stop the dread from settling into her chest. A strange scraping sound came from the hallway, sharp and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the floorboards. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her eyes snapping to the dark doorway that led into the hall. She sat there, frozen, straining to hear, but the house was silent again. She blinked, shaking her head. It had to be the wind, she told herself. The house was old, it was to be expected. But as she returned her gaze to the fire, a cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the papers on the nearby desk and making the flames flicker. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, a cold that seemed to creep into her very bones. It wasn't the storm. It was something inside the house. Something was moving. Something was here. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling, and walked toward the hallway. The sound had come from that direction, she was certain of it. The old house creaked beneath her feet, every step seeming to echo louder than the last. The hallway was long, the shadows stretching ominously toward the staircase that led to the second floor. As she walked further into the darkness, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, pressing against her chest. The shadows moved, or maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The scratching sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft tap, 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 faint but unmistakable. She turned the corner and saw it. The attic door, slightly ajar, with an unnatural draft spilling out into the hallway. The attic had always felt off to her since the first time she had stepped foot in the house. There was something about the way the door creaked, the way the air in the attic smelled musty and old, that set her on edge. But tonight, the door seemed to call to her, as if it were waiting for her to open it. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave the house and never look back, but there was something in her gut, that told her she needed to see what was behind that door. Emma reached out, her hand shaking as she grasped the doorknob. The air around her felt heavier now, the temperature plummeting with each second. She turned the knob slowly, feeling the cool metal under her fingertips. The door creaked open, revealing the steep, narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The stairs were old, uneven, and covered in dust, as though they hadn't been used in years. A chill ran through her as she stepped forward, her flashlight flickering as she shone it up the staircase. The beam of light barely cut through the thick darkness above, but Emma could feel it. The presence in the attic, the heavy weight of something waiting for her. Her feet felt like lead as she ascended the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath her weight. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, like something, or someone, was desperately trying to escape. Emma's breath quickened, and her pulse pounded in her ears. She had to get to the top, she had to see what was making that noise. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the temperature dropped even further, the cold now seeping into her very bones. She shone the flashlight around, the weak beam revealing nothing but shadows and forgotten boxes, dust-covered furniture, and old crates stacked haphazardly in the corners. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was silent. Emma stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as she scanned the attic. The cold was unbearable now, like it was coming from every corner, every inch of the room. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against her from all sides. The flashlight flickered again, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as the beam landed on something in the far corner. A figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the old furniture. But as the flashlight flickered again, she saw it more clearly. A shape, hunched over in the corner, its back turned to her. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. The figure was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and it seemed to be covered in something dark, matted, as if it had been living in the shadows for far too long. Emma's heart raced, her chest tightening with fear. It hadn't made a sound. It just sat there, motionless, as though it were waiting for her to notice it. Suddenly, the figure turned. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, dark, hollow, seemed to pierce through her. Emma took a step back, her breath shallow as her mind tried to process what she was seeing. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure's movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was struggling to stand, as though it had been trapped in that corner for years, unable to move. And then, as if it had been waiting for her all along, it spoke. Its voice was low, guttural, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep within. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down Emma's spine. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and the air around her seemed to grow thicker, suffocating her with its weight. It took a slow, deliberate step toward her, its movements unnervingly fluid despite its twisted form. Emma's legs gave way beneath her, and she stumbled backward, her hands flailing for something to grab. But the attic was empty, save for the figure and the boxes that had long since been abandoned. As she scrambled to her feet, her flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor, its light spinning wildly in every direction before finally landing on the figure. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure lunged forward, its hands reaching out for her, its mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. Emma didn't even have time to react. Before she could take another breath, the room plunged into darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma's mind raced as she stood motionless, frozen in place, her heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the sound of the wind outside. For a moment, everything seemed to disappear. The attic, the figure, the storm outside. It was just her, standing alone in the suffocating blackness. She blinked, trying to focus, but the darkness was too thick, too consuming. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the chill in the air cutting through her clothes like icy needles. She reached for the flashlight, her fingers trembling, and in the sudden stillness, she could hear nothing but the soft, erratic sound of her breathing. She had to move, had to get away, but the fear that had rooted her in place was overwhelming. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. She fumbled for the flashlight on the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The beam flickered back to life, casting a weak, wavering light over the attic. For a split second, Emma thought she saw something move, a shadow shifting just beyond the beam. She spun around, the beam of light darting wildly across the room, but the figure was gone. There was nothing but dust, cobwebs, and old, forgotten belongings. The attic was empty, but Emma knew what she had seen. She couldn't have imagined it. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around frantically. The fear gnawed at her insides, making her chest tighten with each passing second. Her thoughts spun in circles, each one more terrifying than the last. What was that thing? What did it want? Was it real? Was she losing her mind? Her hand shook as she tried to steady the flashlight, but the beam bounced erratically, never staying still for more than a second. The shadows seemed to mock her, stretching and shifting in the corners of the room, as if they were alive, watching her every move. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words were lodged in her throat. She was alone. The house was empty, save for her and whatever dark force had found its way into the attic. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine, and the overwhelming sense of being watched settled over her like a heavy cloak. Her thoughts raced back to the night she had first arrived at the house. The excitement she had felt, how she thought the isolation would be a blessing, how she had believed the old house's charm would make her feel safe. Now, everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air was thick with an unnatural heaviness. The wind outside seemed to scream in fury, but here, in the attic, it was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Emma took a deep, steadying breath, willing herself to focus. She couldn't stay in the attic forever. She had to find a way out, to escape whatever was haunting her. She stepped forward, moving cautiously, trying to ignore the pounding in her chest. The flashlight's beam swept across the attic, its weak light revealing the forgotten remnants of the house's past. Old furniture draped in sheets, crates filled with broken odds and ends, cobwebs clinging to every corner. But then, just as she thought she was alone again, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice that wasn't her own. It was soft, desperate, and filled with something dark. Emma froze, her hand still holding the flashlight, her body tense with fear. The voice seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the attic, swirling in the air like a cold mist. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. The voice spoke again, louder this time, and though she still couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable, a pleading, a cry for help, but it wasn't human. It sounded wrong, as if the words were being dragged through thick, suffocating darkness. She glanced around, but there was no one else in the room. She was alone, wasn't she? Then why did it feel like the walls were closing in on her, like something was moving just beyond her reach? Emma's pulse quickened as she took a step back, but the floorboard creaked beneath her weight, and her heart skipped a beat. The attic seemed to tilt, the shadows warping and twisting, and for a moment, she felt dizzy, as though the world was spinning out of control. The whispering grew louder, closer, filling her mind with a steady stream of incoherent words. She couldn't understand it, but she felt the weight of it in her chest, as though it was a message meant only for her. Her breath hitched, and the flashlight's beam flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the room.